Hello everyone, it's Thursday and you're watching Within the Frame. I'm Kim Bo-kyung. Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen on Wednesday afternoon embarked on her 10-day trip to visit Central America. Tsai is expected to stop over in New York on the way in and Los Angeles on the way out, and all eyes are on whether Tsai will meet U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy in California. Tsai leaving Taiwan comes just a few days after Taiwan's former President Ma Ying-jeou made the first visit to mainland China by a past or current leader since 1949. Beijing already warned Tsai of retaliation if the meeting between Tsai and McCarthy does take place, while Washington says there's no reason for Beijing to overreact. Now, Taiwan finds itself caught between superpowers as rival leaders each visit the U.S. and China. For an in-depth analysis on cross-strait issues, we welcome Chung Ku-youn, Assistant Professor at Kangwon National University. Professor Chung, welcome, and thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
And we also have Jeff Moon on the line, President of China Moon Strategies. Mr. Moon, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be here.
All right, first question to Professor Chung. Former Taiwan President Ma Ying-jeou arrived in Shanghai on Monday, becoming the first past or current president from Taiwan to ever visit the mainland since the end of Chinese Civil War in 1949. Now, what's behind the decision to make the trip, in your opinion?
Well, actually, it's not just President Ma who is traveling at this moment. The previous President Ma is traveling to mainland China, while the incumbent President Tsai is traveling to the United States and Latin America. So this parallel travels actually contrast the different policy line between two leaders and two political parties, Kuomintang and Democratic Progress Party, on how they want to deal with China, more specifically on Taiwan Strait issue. Kuomintang obviously wants to highlight it is taking more conciliatory positions toward China, while Democratic Progress Party rather emphasize independence from China. So as Taiwan is approaching toward the election next year, next January, this cross-strait issue is one of the priorities for Taiwanese voters. So they are attempting to mobilize their respective supporters. And in this context, China also defines President Tsai and her party as separatist forces, attempting independence and refused to have a dialogue with, while China currently welcomes the previous President Ma and seems to recognize him as a legitimate counterpart ahead of the next year election. So it sends a clear signal to Taiwanese voters on which side or which candidate they should support.
Right. So the main aim is to convene supporters for the upcoming presidential election. Now, Mr. Moon, when Ma served as president for 8 years, I believe it was between 2008 to 2016, it is said that he brought about an unprecedented improvement in ties between Taiwan and the mainland based on the compromise agreement known as 1992 Consensus. Now, what is this consensus? And after current Taiwan President Tsai Ing-wen took power and rejected it, how have relations between two sides deteriorated?
The so-called 1992 Consensus reflects the debate between China and Taiwan over Taiwan's political status. In 1992, Ma Ying-jeou agreed in principle with China that Taiwan and mainland China are part of, quote, one China, without defining exactly what China means. Ma met with Xi Jinping in Singapore in 2015, and he also pushed a controversial trade deal with China that prompted widespread public protests in Taiwan and was never finalized before Ma left office in 2016. So the Democratic Progressive Party, which currently holds power in Taiwan under Tsai Ing-wen, refused to endorse the so-called 1992 consensus formulation of one China and wants to promote Taiwan's autonomy instead. As a result, Beijing cut off informal ties and exchanges with Tsai's government after she was elected in 2016. Beijing has also increased efforts to isolate Taiwan in international organizations and by pressuring other nations that recognize Taiwan to switch recognition to Beijing.
Right, I see. Now, Professor Chung, so current Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen, like you said before, from the ruling Democratic Progressive Party, began her 10-day trip to Central America from the 29th and is to transit through U.S. twice. Now, she is largely expected to meet with U.S. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. If the meeting does take place, what is most likely to be on the agenda?
Well, it's not likely they were going to have a substantial agenda that will actually affect the U.S.-Taiwan relations, but they will celebrate the solidarity between two countries. So in that sense, the meeting with the Kevin McCarthy itself is a kind of provocation against China. It is meaningful in itself. And China already warns about holding such meetings with Kevin McCarthy will face a tremendous cost, and criticize President Tsai as a separatist forces. However, traveling to the United States for President Tsai, it will demonstrate the significance of the United States for Taiwan's self-defense and more support from the world. At the same time, this Democratic Progress Party will use this trip to the United States to celebrate success at handling relations with the United States and to show that despite losing its former diplomatic allies, for instance, like Honduras in this case, Taiwan has a greater international space than ever, from the Taiwan to the kind of across the Pacific Ocean to the United States.
Right. So there might be no substantial result coming out from the meeting, but still it could have political significance. Now, Mr. Moon, Ma's visit to mainland and Tsai's trip to Washington, these moves come with less than 10 months to go until Taiwan's presidential election, like our Professor Chung just previously pointed out. Now, could you tell us what implication their visits have in terms of the upcoming presidential election, more in specific?
Broadly speaking, Ma and the Kuomintang are trying to appeal to voters who want Beijing and Taipei to reach an accommodation on reunification issues, while Tsai's voter base and the Democratic Progressive Party have traditionally emphasized Taiwan's autonomy. Ma's visit comes in the midst of a Chinese charm campaign designed to increase domestic support in Taiwan for reunification. So Ma's statements during his visit to China that we are all Chinese on both sides of the Taiwan Strait are music to Beijing's ears. The Chinese official responsible for cross-strait relations has signaled a desire to improve ties, and a Chinese white paper on Taiwan published in August of last year also states that Taiwan would enjoy a high degree of autonomy as a special administrative region after reunification with China. Taiwan's and Tsai's voter base does not trust China, has little desire to reunify, and is mindful of the example of China's unfulfilled promises of autonomy to Hong Kong. Meanwhile, polls show that more than half of Taiwan's population does not regard itself as ethnically Chinese. So Tsai's trip to North America is designed to show voters that she's actively defending and asserting Taiwan's autonomy. Ultimately, of course, voters will decide whether Taiwan will adopt Ma's or Tsai's suggested approach.
Right, we'll have to see how voters decide. Now, Professor Chung, when then U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan last year, August, tensions peaked very much with Beijing responding very much aggressively by launching massive war drills near Taiwan. And the spokesperson for China's Taiwan Affairs Office already warned that Beijing will fight back if the meeting between Tsai and McCarthy does happen. What level of aggression can we expect?
Well, I believe the level of aggressions would be pretty similar or higher with compared to the previous case when the former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi visited. But it should be noted that China at this moment continues its military pressure targeting Taiwan by sending military aircraft and ships around Taiwan, even while the former Taiwanese President Ma is visiting China. So that's the whole point, and I think that shows that there are real intentions behind these aggressions. And also, it should be understood that it is not just a kind of response toward the President Tsai's visit to the United States, but it is a tactic to create a new normal for Chinese military aircraft invasion of the middle line of the Taiwan Strait and Taiwan's air defense identification zone, which could be regarded as a grazing tactics to turn a specific area into a conflict zone without triggering the United States' immediate responses.
Right, I see. Now, Mr. Moon, shifting gears a little bit here, longtime Taiwan ally Honduras ended ties with Taipei in favor of Beijing, and that came a day before Ma's visit to the mainland. And reports say it was mainly due to Beijing's offer of huge economic assistance. What's behind Honduras' severing of ties with Taiwan, and is financial aid from Beijing in exchange for creating ties with China instead of Taiwan usual?
China and Taiwan have for many years competed with each other over diplomatic recognition. And as China has become increasingly prosperous, Chinese promises of access to their market have been a major factor in decisions to switch recognition. Another major factor has been so-called checkbook diplomacy. China has established a playbook that includes funding for development projects such as large government buildings, stadiums, and other prominent infrastructure projects. In the specific case of Honduras, Reuters reported recently seeing a document in which the Honduran foreign minister reportedly asked Taiwan for $2.5 billion in assistance for various development projects. Honduras denied that report, and Taiwan authorities would only say that Honduras demanded a very high price in order to maintain relations. In any event, checkbook diplomacy is conducted in secret. Local populations are usually not sure what benefits are provided and to whom. Most of the development projects that China offers also come with financing terms that are not sustainable and sometimes have resulted in Chinese control of local assets and infrastructure. So for that reason, the U.S. government warned Honduran officials recently that they need to evaluate Chinese offers carefully because there may be unexpected and unfortunate results.
Right, because there could be attachments to the agreement. Now, Professor Zhang, it is not surprising to see China trying to expand its partnerships and influence with countries across Latin America. But while China has been attracting South American countries since 2001, as far as I know, it had paid relatively little attention to Central America. Is this true? And if this is correct, why is Beijing trying to expand its influence in Central America as well?
Well, my understanding is that increasing ties with countries in those areas demonstrate the decline of the United States in the region, I think. As the power of the United States declines, countries with diplomatic ties with Taiwan are choosing to establish diplomatic ties with China, which Moon just mentions provides a huge economic package and infrastructure projects. And given that China is emphasizing the principle of one China, they have to making a choice between two countries. And also, China has been continuing to implement the South-South cooperation in this area, and not just in this area, but sub-Saharan Africa and other developing countries. So use this as a diplomatic leverage to isolate Taiwan. It's been a long time, especially since President Tsai took office in 2016. Already 8 countries have severed these ties with Taiwan, and now Taiwan has only 13 countries left. So I think in this respect, China is increasing its influence in this region.
Right. Now, Mr. Moon, as our Professor Chung just pointed out, Honduras' switch of diplomatic recognition to Beijing leaves Taiwan with just 13 official diplomatic allies, mostly small nations in Latin America and the Pacific. How does the cutting of ties by such nations affect Taiwan's overall economy and social status? And will Taiwan be able to sustain relations with these remaining countries?
Space is extremely important in Chinese culture, and the main impact of decisions to switch recognition is a loss of face for Taiwan and Taiwan leaders. China undoubtedly timed the Honduras announcement to coincide with Tsai's trip to the United States to undercut her efforts to highlight Taiwan's strength and autonomy. Generally speaking, though, countries that have officially switched recognition to Beijing have continued to maintain unofficial contacts with Taiwan, and that includes the United States. Taiwan has the functional equivalent of ambassadors and embassies in all major capitals and has no difficulty maintaining economic relations. In today's high-tech world, Taiwan occupies a special place in the global economy because it's the home to TSMC, the company that manufactures 95% of the world's most advanced semiconductors. In the case of TSMC, not only do other countries want to maintain economic relations, but they must do so in order to retain ongoing access to the world's most advanced semiconductor products and technologies.
Right, I see. Interesting. Now, Professor Chung, U.S. President Joe Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau last Friday issued a joint statement reiterating the importance of peaceful resolution of cross-strait issues. But as we all know, China is firmly standing by its one China policy. How are tensions between the U.S. and China regarding cross-strait issues affecting international politics right now?
Well, Taiwan issue involves many dimensions to discuss. First, it is a kind of changing status quo unilaterally, especially with the use of forces, will be regarded as a revisionist behavior that destabilizes the regional orders, and especially regional allies, South Korea and Japan, will pay attention on how U.S. will react, because that's kind of test bed what could happen to South Korea and Japan in case of regional contingency occurs. And second, Taiwan is a testbed from which democracies can predict their fate under the rise of authoritarian countries, especially Russia, in the case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And of course, China is another case. So how democracy can coalesce to demonstrate solidarity is the kind of will be shown to the case of Taiwan. And lastly, as just Moon mentions, Taiwan is an important partner in terms of securing supply chain of semiconductor, not just for the United States, but to the regional allies and like-minded countries for their economic security. So in many dimensions, Taiwan's stability is pretty important. So that's why U.S. and Canada provide this joint statement regarding the importance of peaceful resolution.
Right, I see. Now, Mr. Moon, this week has been very interesting. Tensions between China and the U.S. are apparent with two big international meetings taking place in the same week. China hosted the 2023 Boao Forum for Asia in Hainan, while the Summit for Democracy, which includes the U.S. and South Korea, kicked off on Wednesday, which was just yesterday. Now, how is each country trying to expand its bloc, and what do you believe is the future for Washington and China relations?
It's true that China is hosting the Boao Forum and the U.S. is hosting the Summit for Democracy at more or less the same time, but these are not equivalent events, and making comparisons can be misleading. Boao is an event focused on economic issues that's putting a spotlight on China and its efforts to reopen after the pandemic. The main topics for discussion are business and economic issues, as well as the usual networking opportunities. This is another example of China trying to assert global leadership by creating an institution that parallels an existing Western institution, in this case, the annual Davos meetings. In contrast, the Summit of Democracies is a political event intended to reinforce and encourage democratic institutions throughout the world. Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. So the idea is to highlight the virtues and recognize the limitations of democratic government while encouraging efforts to perfect democratic traditions. And yes, the event is also intended to highlight the contrast between nations with free and open societies and other countries that have repressive and authoritarian governments. As for U.S.-China relations, they are really at their lowest point since the 1970s. And I don't see a significant improvement likely in the short term. I am hopeful, though, that somehow both sides will recognize how important it is to maintain a positive relationship, and maybe things will improve at some point in the future.
Right. Now, Professor Chung, South Korea too could be affected by the ongoing conflict between Beijing and Washington. How is Seoul affected by it, and what can South Korea learn from Taiwan's method of diplomacy?
Well, South Korea's relation with the U.S. and China is very intimate at the same time, very complex. So that's why previous administration, Moon Jae-in administration, tried to hedging the risk of great power competitions and maintain strategic autonomy between two great powers. Not only about South Korea's its own autonomy, but also we have North Korea issue and Taiwanese issue, also South China Sea issue. All of these regional issues will affecting South Korea's fate in the future. So in that sense, maintaining stability and maintaining kind of peaceful relation between the countries is pretty important. But when we look at Taiwan's case, And when we look at President Ma and President Tsai's behavior, we can see the contrasting kind of understanding about how they can maintain strategic autonomy between two great powers, especially when two great powers are competing over the dominance in the regions. And President Tsai seems to decide their way of maintaining their strategic autonomy by aligning with like-minded countries, because they define their identity as similar to those democracies, and they are assured by like-minded countries' support. So that tells something about how democracies, South Korea, can maintain their strategic autonomy in terms of given the situation of great power competition.
Right, I see. I'd like to ask more to our experts, but unfortunately, this is all the time we have for today's edition. But thank you, Professor Chung and Mr. Moon, for your insights for today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
This is all for Within the Frame tonight. We will be back tomorrow with more in-depth stories. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.